I'm James Taylor, and you're listening to the Super Creativity Podcast, a show dedicated to inspiring creative minds like yours. Dr. Amy Climer teaches teams and organizations how to increase their creativity so they can maximize innovation. She works with forward-thinking organizations such as the Mayo Clinic, Stanford University, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Amy is the author of the best-selling book, Deliberate Creative Teams: How to Lead for Innovative Results. She is also the host of another fantastic website, which you've got to check out, called the Deliberate Creative Podcast, where she shares practical advice and strategies to help leaders build innovative teams. Amy has a PhD in leadership and change and is a certified speaking professional, CSP. Please welcome to the Super Creativity Podcast, Dr. Amy Climer.
Thank you. It's so good to be here, James.
So I love, obviously, there's a huge amount of synergy with the work that you do and the listeners for this show as well. But I want to know, just take us right back to the start. What first drew you to creativity research? And was there a kind of personal moment that set you on this path?
Yeah, I've been very curious about creativity, honestly, probably since high school. I remember I was the friend who, if one of my friends said, "Oh no, I'm not creative, I can't draw," and I would just be like, "Yes, you can. It's just about practice, and you just have to, apply yourself." And I would get all emphatic and try to, build them up, and I think I just intuitively had a sense that creativity was more than drawing, which of course, as you know, is a misnomer that a lot of people get confused about. And then right after college, I stumbled upon the book, The Artist's Way, which I'm sure you're familiar with and many listeners are, a classic book that really helped me see creativity in a new light. And then later I started teaching workshops, helping other people understand how creativity works. And all the while professionally, I was building skills in facilitation and team building and team development. And so eventually, probably not until my 30s, I got really serious about integrating these two things, the creativity and the team development. And then I really geeked out about it and decided to go get a PhD and study this deeply, and finished that about 10 years ago. But now I have a consulting practice where I help teams and organizations understand how creativity really works.
So let's imagine you're on that flight, you're traveling out to maybe facilitate a workshop or give a keynote speech. The person sitting next to you said, so what do you do? How do you normally respond? Because you are a multi-hyphenate type of person. How do you describe what you do?
I usually say I teach teams and organizations how to be more creative and innovative. And then they are like, "Really? You can do that?" Which obviously you can, but yes.
Now, you went on this journey. Obviously, there's the strong academic side to what you do. You developed the creative synergy scale based on surveys and real teams. What question or problem were you setting out to solve in the process of kind of working and finding this scale?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the scale is actually called the Deliberate Creative Team Scale now. But the purpose of that assessment is to measure teams' behaviors around creativity. And I think that there's some other measures out there that measures, how creative someone might be, or there's other measures that are looking at kind of our personality in relation to our creativity and our creative output. But I really wanted to look at, well, what are we actually doing? What are those behaviors? And so the scale is actually where I also developed this model called the Deliberate Creative Team Model. And it measures these three areas that teams need if they're going to be creative together. And we can get into those if you'd like. But I think what I love about this scale is it's looking at the behaviors and what are people actually doing, which can be really interesting and really eye-opening.
So take us there then. Tell us about this. You say that creativity comes when teams have purpose, dynamics, and process, and all this aligns as well. So is this a kind of Venn diagram? Do these things overlap? How do they all work together?
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I'll throw up a visual for those of you who are watching this video of it. But very basic Venn diagram with that. These are the three elements that I discovered in the research that are critical for teams to be creative together. So there's the team purpose, team dynamics, and team creative process. And I know you've talked about these on your podcast before. And it was actually through development of the scale that these evolved. And then we're getting all into the statistics and how do you develop these things. But what's interesting is, I think that sometimes teams think they're doing certain things really well. Like they think they have a creative process, but when I ask them what it is, they have no idea and they can't actually describe it. Or they describe something that just feels kind of convoluted and not very clear. Or they think they have a clear team purpose, but then when you ask them what their team purpose is, they can't actually answer the question. And so this scale helps them, and this model helps them understand, oh yeah, here's what we need to develop further.
So let's imagine a perfect scenario, which never really exists. But
sure.
we have a company, we have a team. Let's choose an industry. They're in engineering, mechanical engineering. My wife's a mechanical engineer originally, so let's choose that as they're in a mechanical engineering, making really super advanced kind of parts. Break down those kind of three elements and what is the perfect situation from that team? What do they need to be doing in each of those areas? Purpose, dynamics, purpose, and process, in order for those things to fully align.
Okay, I love this. All right, and I actually love working with engineering teams. I've worked with a number of them. Okay, so first off, I think the team needs to get clarity on what's their purpose. And there's different layers to understanding purpose. So first, there's the purpose of the entire organization or company. That might be the mission statement or something along mission, vision, whatever. But then what's the purpose of this specific team, both in the big picture, how does it fit into that organization, but then even more specifically, the purpose for this project. Now, the challenge with understanding purpose in relation to innovation is there has to be enough space within that purpose for you to actually innovate. And so if the purpose is super narrow, then you're not going to have that wiggle room to come up with new ideas and go in different directions. In fact, there's some interesting research that looked at that purpose sometimes comes later, that sometimes a team is working on their project, whatever they're trying to do, and they don't really know the purpose of it. And it would be for more like emergent innovation. Probably not going to apply as much for a team like this, because often they might be working together like, hey, we have this very specific problem that we're looking at and we're trying to solve this problem. So that's part of their purpose right there, and getting clarity on that. Okay, so team purpose. Team dynamics are our ability to trust each other, to feel safe. I know you've talked about psychological safety on the podcast before. That's really important for teams to be more innovative together. So trust, psychological safety, put those together. Also, our ability to engage in conflict. And there's certain types of conflict that are particularly useful and some that are not. And then, of course, our ability to communicate with each other. And this is the one that's overly obvious, but sometimes we gloss over it a bit too much. But that trust, conflict, communication is all a part of the team dynamics. And so then the third piece is that process. And what's the process a team is using to actually innovate together? So I think about what happens when the team sits down at a table together or jumps on a Zoom call together. What are their meetings like? How do they start? Are they just a report out where everybody's sharing updates? Because that's not going to necessarily lead to innovation. In fact, people are probably going to, get a little glassy-eyed and zone out a bit. But what is that collaboration? And so there are many processes you can use, many strategies and techniques. The process that I teach my clients most often is called creative problem solving. And it's a very basic process. It's designed based on how we as humans naturally solve problems. And I'm sure if you haven't talked about this process on your podcast, you've talked about other ones. I've heard a couple of your episodes where you're going through like the ideation process. But when we have a process, we can be clear about where are we? What are we doing right now? Like, for instance, we start off, let's clarify what the problem is. We need to really deeply understand that problem, which is a spot many teams skip over. And then generate some ideas, and what are the best ideas to solve that particular problem. And then I often say, when we come up with an idea, it'll like fit on a Post-it note. There's nothing to it. It's just a sentence. And so it needs to be developed further. And then once that's developed, we can implement it, maybe test it out and see like, all right, would this work? Let's try it at a really small scale. Or, for a mechanical engineering team, maybe like try, let's develop this with a 3D printer first, or cardboard, or like how basic can we get before we're spending millions of dollars to produce something big. Anyway, that's a bit of the...
So let's go through, it's interesting going through some of those, like on the purpose one, you have a team. Sometimes people know each other well, sometimes they don't. They're coming together. Do you ever find that initially people kind of think they're coming into that team meeting to ideate, to work on maybe it's going to be solving a problem, and find that the purpose, when they leave the room after an hour, they've actually decided that the purpose that they're about is not the purpose that they initially thought when they went into the room?
Yes, and I think that's actually... You just spoke to the value of that conversation. Is like, you think the problem is here, the problem is X, but actually start digging into it and it's actually Y or Z or A or B or whatever. It's something different. If you didn't spend time clarifying, then you would have solved for the wrong problem. And I see this happen all the times in teams. And there's some interesting research by this guy, Roger Firestein, where he found that if you just spend 5 minutes clarifying, sometimes that's enough. So it doesn't have to be this long drawn out thing, although sometimes you do need more than 5 minutes, but even 5 minutes makes a difference and can get better results.
It's interesting. I always try and start those kind of meetings with just asking a whole bunch of series of questions. I think MIT, they call it kind of question bursts. They use different... I think we've had a guest on, Gregerson, Professor Gregerson, that came on the show talking about MIT question bursts. And he said often when you kind of get it at the start of the meeting and you're asking a series of questions, before you get into thinking about solutions, he said you often find out the problem you thought was a problem isn't the main problem at all. There's something that sits behind it that if you just didn't spend those first few minutes just getting all those different stakeholders in the room on the same page as to like, this is really why we're here, he said you end up wasting a lot of time.
I totally agree with that. Yeah. It's like, just let's dig into a little bit. And sometimes one of the techniques that I use, I don't know if you've talked about it on this your show, but are you familiar with ethnographic interviews? This technique?
I've heard of this. Yes. Okay.
Is very simple, and it's actually there's a whole research arm, research methodology called ethnographic interviews, but this is a very light version of it, where basically you're just going and talking to the people who have the problem you're trying to solve. It doesn't mean you have to like bring them all in the meeting. I mean, sometimes that's not appropriate or realistic, but it might be picking up the phone or walking down the street or, wherever people who have this problem are, go talk to them. And you're asking them questions for, anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, depending on the situation. But even asking them questions for 10 minutes, you might get a completely different perspective of what's actually going on and realize, oh, okay, now we understand it better from their perspective. And that's going to change how we ideate.
You've just given a very academic fancy label to something I'm thinking I often do where what's that there's an expression in America, is like a $10 word, or there's something like there's this kind of thing
like a 10-cent word.
It's like a 10 cent or a $10 word. Anyway, I often think about it when clients come to me, and maybe you find this the same when clients book you in for keynotes, is the person that comes to you is maybe the HR leader or the C-suite in the organization or a VP. And I always ask that before we do the event, can I speak to 2 or 3 of your team members that are going to be at this event in advance? And I'm always fascinated because sometimes I'm having to triangulate between, well, the CEO thinks this is the problem. The people on the ground floor who are dealing with it every day, they see this is the problem. HR sees it from this kind of different problem. And until you kind of start by just putting all that out there, you don't really find, which kind of brings me to that second point, the dynamics piece. So I'm here in Scotland today. And we have Edinburgh, which is the home of the Enlightenment period. And they had a phrase they used to have there, which was called flighting. So flighting is the ritual abuse of your opponent by means of verbal violence. That's basically what it is. So we would think of that as, sometimes if someone comes from outside and they see 2 Scottish people or Italians can be a little bit like this as well. having a really deep discussion about something. It looks like they're fighting, but they're not fighting. They're actually just, they're really passionate. Now, in that dynamics part, you talk about the requirements, that are, things that you required to ensure that you're going to get the best from that team. So can you talk about the dynamics piece?
Yeah. Well, since you brought up this idea of flighting or fighting, or what looks like fighting maybe, one of the pieces is around conflict. And there's a type of conflict, and I love this phrase, called creative abrasion. And so, okay, let me back up first, but I want to explain what creative abrasion is. But let me back up and say, so there's two main types of conflict. There's that relationship conflict where I just don't like you. And for whatever reason, it's like, oh, here goes James again. And I just like check out, right? Like that is never helpful in a team, or I don't know if it's ever helpful in any context. But relationship conflict is not helpful. But then there's task conflict where we're going to disagree about the work or how we approach it or the result, all of that. And in the 1980s, this guy, Jerry Hirschberg, he was hired by Nissan. And at that point, Nissan was trying to meld together the Japanese engineering with the American innovation, and they were building Nissan plants in the US to make new cars. So they hired Jerry Hirschberg to lead this process. And so he gets these teams together of the Japanese and Americans, and they're in Tennessee in the United States, and there was so much conflict. They couldn't even agree on what radio station to listen to in the office, which, in the 1980s, that's what you might argue about. And eventually he kind of realized this is really good, maybe not the radio station debate, but these different perspectives coming together were really important. And there were times where the team was so polite with each other that they weren't getting anywhere. And so he started to push them, and he called this creative abrasion, that we need to disagree about the work and, in this case, how they design the cars. And what happens if the team, in the team meeting, everyone's like, oh yeah, that looks fine. Yeah, the headlight looks great. And then out in the hallway, there's a conversation like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're going to go with that headlight design. It looks hideous. That's not helping anybody. And actually what would be better is let's bring that conversation into the team meetings, into the, and you can have a time and a place for it. It's not like you're always in debate, because that's also not helpful. But being able to engage in that creative abrasion can be really valuable. And I would say that's really hard without a level of psychological safety and a level of trust.
It reminds me a little bit of, there was a few years ago, there was a series of airline incidents, crashes. One airline, Korean Airlines, I seem to remember, was the airline. And they played back the tapes, the black box tapes, and they would hear something along the lines of, often the way that they had the pilots, that the pilot was very senior, much older, and the co-pilot was usually much younger, much more junior. That was they had quite a big dynamic there. And you would hear things like the co-pilot, the junior, saying to the pilot, Captain, I can see that mountain is getting very close just now. And then a few seconds would go by. Captain, yes, that mountain is definitely getting closer. and there was a cultural thing in terms of seniority. And what they had to do when they went through it on the safety side, they actually sent all the pilots to the United States to go and train again, to teach them, I guess, assertiveness, or just kind of knock some of that stuff out. Now, actually, I quite like there's something very nice about parts of Asia where they're very a little bit more mellow with things.
Yeah,
but yeah. So I love this idea of this creative abrasion. It's and I think I see this sometimes. I was in a kind of co-working innovation incubation district of a city. I won't say what the city was. And it had looked like it had been designed by an architecture firm. And it was perfect. It was beautiful. It had all the things, tick, tick, tick. It had it in terms of the kind of spaces and that kind of design there. And I just turned to the person I was walking around with it, and I said, this is not right. It lacks the kind of that kind of abrasion you're talking about of a Berlin or parts of London, or parts, if you go to San Francisco, Tenderloin or bits, it's a little, there's something that you need a little bit of that rubbing up against each other, I guess.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love both these examples. Yeah, I do remember reading about the airline pilots, and yeah, I do feel like, yeah, we need to like bump up against each other. And if we're too polite, whether it's because of hierarchy or culture or whatever it is, that can also be a problem. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to be rude to each other, because that's obviously the other end of the spectrum. But your example about, the city, it totally fits. I actually live in a place, I live in Asheville, North Carolina, which is more on that kind of grungier end, like the San Francisco, the Berlin. I mean, we're a small city, only 100,000 people or so, but we're known for being a artistic, creative place. And I love that about living here, is that, there's sections of town that have a lot of graffiti and murals, and, somebody just like gets an idea and they just go do it. To a degree, right? And I feel like that's almost like a little bit different than going through this formal process, but sometimes there needs to be space there for just these ideas to evolve. Like, yeah, let's try that. That sounds interesting. Let's see what happens. And maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but you figure that out in the process.
I think you often see it in places with like high immigration coming in from other places. I mean, obviously America has benefited very much from that over the centuries. I was just recently in Vienna speaking at an kind of manufacturing conference, and you look at the history of that place, and they had these two great golden ages in Vienna, and they both came at the same time, where they had massive, actually, immigration coming in from different places. One was because one empire was collapsing, and then all these people were kind of coming in. And there was tension within that. There was that kind of abrasiveness, because you had people with very different perspectives. They ate different food. They liked different things. But from that, it kind of created this combustion of ideas. And actually, America benefited from that, because many of those people that ended up moving to, in the 1930s and 20s and 30s and 40s, they ended up moving to the United States, and all those things that we think of as American today, like a shopping malls, they all came from, or kitchens, like fitted kitchens. They were all Viennese ideas, or modern advertising, scientific based advertising. These were all Viennese ideas that came from that as well. So you've got this team, they're starting to get aligned. But when you're working with different organizations, what are the most common blocks that you see in their people, or the way that these teams are kind of formed in different ways, that are holding them back from really unleashing their creative potential?
Okay, so I think one of the big blocks, well, when I ask clients, I say, what are your big blocks? What are your barriers to creativity? One of the things they always say is time. And I get it, right? Like we live in this world right now that's just really busy and fast paced, and people have this really high expectations, and they think, if I order something online, I should be able to get it in 2 hours or at most 2 days. And so I get that I believe that is true on some level, that we do struggle with fitting all the things in a given day. But I also try to push back a little bit and say, well, are there things that you're doing that you don't need to be doing anymore? And are there processes in your business that could be changed because they're outdated? Or, I was talking to one client, and turned out there was one of the employees produced a particular report every month. This was just something that they had been doing. They were told to do, years ago. They'd been producing this report every month. It took them several hours to do. No one was looking at it. And so in the middle of the meeting, they said, wait, so can I stop creating this report? And everyone was like, yeah, we don't do that anymore. And so, this conversation just happened to come up. It wasn't like we went around and all were like, what reports are you producing that you don't need to produce? But I feel like there are things like that every organization does, every individual does, that in fact, in my book, I call it antiquated bureaucratic remnants, that we all have these things that have just stayed in the company that no longer need to be done. So I think that's one thing, is time, but then more specifically is maybe really doing an analysis of how you're spending your time. I think another thing which kind of is similar, but taking a look at the processes you're using and how that affects team dynamics, how that affects your innovation. So an example, I'm leading a retreat later this month for a client for their leadership team, and they were telling me that one of the challenges they've had is just some respect between people in the organization, where, for instance, the marketing team will put together a document and send it out to, a handful of people, say, hey, can I get your input on this? I just want to make sure this aligns with the work you're doing. And the response back often is like really snarky. Like, wait, you need me to look at this? Don't you know how to do your own job? And it's like, whoa, okay, hold on a second. But when they were describing this to me, I thought, I wonder how that process, that communication process from one employee to the next could be changed, and might that change the communication and the conversation? And so, like, what's the question that's being asked? Is this being sent via email? Is this being sent with enough time? Is it like, hey, can you read this 4-page article? I need your response by tomorrow. Yeah, that's going to probably create a little frustration. But I don't know, does that make sense? Where it's just like, if you change the process, we might change the conversation.
I remember, as you're saying it, something like with that Amazon, the Amazon memo, where, I mean, we get emails from people asking us to look at things, review things, not with any. It's either they want us to be included in that loop, or sometimes it's because they want to be able to show off, and they feel really proud about what they've created, and it's a way of just getting some validation for what they've created. I'm talking to you marketers here, if any of you are listening, marketing. But I always liked what Amazon did, where they would, at the start of the meeting, they would be coming in to discuss something as a team. They would just spend those first few minutes. Everyone was given the document, maybe it's a 4-page document or 6-page document, to read with the thing, or the thing that the problem, or the something that the marketing team had created to think about how to solve this problem, or the numbers or the report, whatever the thing was. So everyone was literally on the same page. Yeah. And then they discussed it at the same time. And I think that's actually, that's quite a respectful way of using people's time, because we're all busy, we're always getting bombarded with things. But just to say, and I'm constantly amazed getting on conference calls sometimes where there's 15 people on the call, and I have to ask the question, why is there 15 people on this call? And sometimes it's because of presenteeism, which is not good as well. But I really like what you said about the time piece. And it reminds me, I think we had a guest on the show talking about this, or I filmed a solo podcast episode about it. Was everyone talks about innovation, but no one really wants to talk about exnovation, removing things. And actually, that's often the most difficult thing to do, because we always done this, or we've always done it this way. And so what you're talking about is kind of exnovation there. It's like why are we still doing this report? This is no longer serving us.
100%. I totally agree with you. Like, what do we need to let go of? And yeah, I just had a personal experience with that a few years ago. Well, I have a podcast called The Deliberate Creative, and when COVID hit, my work, it kind of happened organically, but I started shifting, and for a couple of years, I was just teaching people how to be more engaging and interactive on Zoom, because that's like, people kept asking me how to do this. So I kind of shifted a little bit, and what happened is my podcast, like, I just didn't have the time and energy for it. So it was kind of almost accidentally put on hiatus, but it actually served me really well, and it served my clients really well, because I now had the energy to do this other work that they were very specifically asking me to do. And I was able to create some online courses and whatnot. And the podcast is coming back now, but and there was a period where, I'll admit, I was sort of beating myself up about that. Like, oh gosh, I haven't recorded a podcast episode in so long. And then I realized, wait a minute, this actually was perfect. I needed to let go of that in order to innovate in this new way.
create that space. And I've certainly done it before with projects we've had, which have been like a weekly thing that goes out. It could be a newsletter or a type of show we've done. And actually one day I've just said, you know what? Let's just stop it and see if anyone writes in and complains and say, "Oh, I really miss." And if we don't get enough of those, then won't continue. We're not going to restart it anyway. Yeah. So you've gone this really interesting journey, the academic side, the writing, obviously the workshop, working with your clients, and the keynotes as well. Who is personally influenced, would you say, you the most when it comes to creativity? So a teacher or maybe a particular client that you worked with or mentor.
So many people. Okay, I'm going to go back to when I was quite young. I had a teacher who I was fortunate to have 3 different years in 5th, 6th, and 8th grade. And her name was Mrs. Shar, Mrs. Elliott Shar. And actually, speaking of immigrants, she was an immigrant to the U.S. from Cuba. Amazing human. And she was someone who really encouraged all of us to be creative in a way that was aligned with who we were, meaning, she was very good at helping you kind of identify your strengths and what you liked and what you were good at and encouraging those. And I think that gave me some self-confidence because this field, there's not a lot of people who have decided, I'm going to dedicate my life to teaching people how to be creative. I mean, a little bit more now in the last maybe few years, but and I didn't even think about this as a possibility until I was at least 30. But I look back and that was quite profound of just watching how she supported us, how she facilitated the whole class and created really a very psychologically safe space before I knew anything about that, before that was even really being talked about. And I feel really grateful to her for that.
The power of teachers. I just posted something on LinkedIn the other day about a game that I sometimes play on flights, which is I see how long I can go in the flight, or if I can get through the entire flight without the person I'm sitting next to knowing anything about me, and me knowing as much as possible about them. So it's questions. Basically, I'm just using my brain to ask questions, listening, trying to develop my listening skills. And,
so wait, you're having a conversation with them?
Or yeah, just, and I literally, okay. I mean, I was on a flight the other day that I wouldn't say which country I was going to, but it was actually across the aisle, sitting across the aisle from me. There was a lady, and we had a conversation back and forth probably for 10 hours on this flight, and I know by the end of that flight she knew really nothing about me, and but I knew loads about her. I knew her company, I knew some of the problems their company was going for, and one of my tricks for doing that is when they ask you what is your profession, if I want to stop the conversation there or I don't want them to be interested, I'll usually say something like, I work in internal audit. That's a really good one to use because no one wants to. That's the. But the opposite of that, if you want to get someone to engage in a conversation with you on a flight or somewhere, tell them you're a teacher, because every single person has a teacher that made an impact upon their life in some way. In grade school, wherever it was, at university, college, and people will be glowing often about the teachers that they've had, the good teachers they've had in life. There's maybe only been one. So I love that story. So yeah. All power to the teachers. All the power to the teachers here as well. That word creativity is a little bit of a loaded term, especially when we're talking from a business and a commercial standpoint as well. What is the biggest misunderstanding that you think trips up leaders and teams when it comes to this idea of creativity and its relationship to the work that they do?
I've had a couple of CEOs say to me, well, I don't want my team to be creative. I just want them to be innovative. And I kind of look at them funny, like, wait, what? What do you mean? Because to me, I use those words interchangeably all the time. But they think of creativity, when the people that have made this comment think about creativity as being this like fluffy, it's about making art, or it's about doing things that are frivolous and don't have any long-term impact and are just a waste of time. And that's not at all how I see creativity. The definition I use is that creativity is novelty that is valuable. and you could define valuable however you wanted. Financially increases efficiency, aesthetically valuable, whatever it is. And when I dig in and talk about that, they get it. They definitely get it. But I think that, there can be a lot of misnomers around what creativity is, where they think that creativity is about drawing. And it's like, okay, well, drawing is a skill. Creativity is a skill. There maybe is a little bit of an overlap, but it doesn't have to be, right? So I do think there's a lot of, that's one misnomer. I think another myth that I see a lot around creativity is people, not even a myth, I think it's just a misconception, is they think it will just happen. And they don't realize that in order to be creative, you have to be intentional. In fact, I have this phrase I say all the time, which is be deliberate to be creative. It will not happen by accident. And when, if you look at probably any innovation you can think of, there was some intention around it. It didn't just happen. And anyway, we perpetuate some stories that,
I'm wondering, I see that as well in terms of different parts of the world where, if you ask them to raise their hand, if they consider themselves to be creative, usually if I'm in South Korea or Japan or China, for example, or India, it'd be a lower score. Whereas if I'm speaking in Europe or definitely in America, it'll be a higher percentage who will consider themselves to be creative. But I've noticed something more recently, which kind of goes across cultures and continents, which is the demographic piece. And I don't know, because you're very close to, because you're working with students all the day as well as working with companies as well. Are you noticing a difference in terms of that younger demographic now, the Gen Z, definitely the millennials, feeling more comfortable about using this word creativity as it relates specifically to business and understanding that link between creativity and innovation?
I think so. I don't work with Gen Z a whole lot, but one thing I've noticed, because I've been asking that same question of, raise your hand if you think you're creative. I've been asking that for about probably 20 years. And I've noticed a change over time. And I'm mostly just working in the US, but 20 years ago, I'd ask that question and not even half the room would raise their hand. And now, it depends on the audience, of course, and the group, but many more people raise their hand. And I think the reason that's happening is because of the national conversation around creativity and innovation has changed. And I think in part because of podcasts like yours. And we're talking about it in a different way. There's so many more books out about it. And there was this pivotal moment in our history. I don't know if you know this story, but in 1950, the president of the American Psychological Association, at their annual meeting, he stood up and he, as part of his speech, his rally cry for the psychologist, he said, "We need to study creativity." And so what happened is from 1950 on, there's this exponential increase of research and understanding around creativity. And, there's always a lag from when research is done to when the world actually hears about it. And sometimes it's even a 20-year lag. But I think it's, we're more in tuned now with what creativity really means than we were 20 years ago. And I think Gen Z is really benefiting from that, for That's sure.
Right. I remember Edward de Bono writing in a book once, he got really annoyed because there was I think it was in the US, one of the big creativity universities taught creative thinking as a skill. And they put this panel together of the world's top thinkers in creativity, and he didn't get invited to it. And the reason he didn't get invited to it was because he was seen as being too commercial with his work. He wasn't almost academic, even though he taught Oxford, actually, but he was not seen in terms of, he was using it with big oil and gas companies, and they were saying, no, that's too commercial as well. So for those, I'm now going to talk to those commercial corporate that are listening just now, those leaders that are listening today. If they could implement just one principle from your book or one idea from that book, what would it be?
I think if you could implement one thing, it would be look at the process. and really take a deep dive. What are your meetings like? If you were just even more narrow, look at your team meetings. Are your team meetings really a place where you're fostering innovation? And because there's incredible potential there. You got, say 10 people on a team, super smart brains in the room. And if you were just spending the meeting doing these like very boring report outs where people are, half listening, I think you're just missing some amazing brain power. So yeah, taking a look at, and I have some ideas in the book, but taking a look at how to really adjust your team meetings would be awesome.
So it's a quick fire questions just to finish up here. Is there a quote that you live by? Is there one quote that you kind of inspires you or kind of guides your life and your work?
I think it would be what I said a few minutes ago. In fact, I even have this on a sticker. I'll hold this up. Be deliberate to be creative. And this is, when people buy the book from me, I send them a sticker as well. But this is, if you want to be creative, if you want to be innovative, you have to be intentional about it. And I think when you are, really amazing things can happen.
And do you have an online resource or a tool or an app that you find very useful in your own creative work?
Yeah. There's a number of tools that I use. There's a couple that I've created that I use personally. So I have this deck of cards that I created called Climer Cards. There's actually two versions of it, but basically these are cards that are designed to really look at that help with the creative process, particularly ideation, but they also really help with the team dynamics. And what they are is they're very basic, very simple. They're like the size of a deck of playing cards, about 50 images. And they're all these images they're drawings or paintings that I did. And so there's things like a light bulb and a bag of groceries and a spool of thread. There's a giraffe, all these different images. And you lay these down on the table. And then let's say you're starting a meeting and you really want to look at, say it's about your budget. You're going to have a whole meeting about your budget. So you lay these cards down on the table and then you ask everybody to pick a card that represents what's your hope for our budget for the next year? And basically the point here is you any question you can think of, any topic you want to talk about, you can frame it so that they answer with a card. So for instance, you ask that question, select a card that represents one hope you have for our budget for the next year. And somebody might pick the giraffe and they might talk about how they really want the team to stretch and think about how they can be innovative with the budget or more creative. I mean, I don't mean creative accounting, like, turning a 3 into an 8, but how might we be more creative in how we bring in our, raise money or bring in more income. And what happens is when you use these cards to ask the question, it shifts the answers. And people get more specific, they get more focused, they say things that they wouldn't have said if you just asked the question without the images. And it's kind of remarkable. It's actually really cool.
I love the idea, creative cards. And it's we had a guest on recently who was talking about emotional granularity, where often when we respond to something, how are you feeling, how are you doing today, fine, okay, and we're sitting in a very narrow emotional range. And she said, if you expand your language, expand the way of thinking about things, it just expands your life as well. So what you're kind of doing there is with those tools is you're developing people's creative range as well, in terms of the ability to express ideas, express emotions, express feeling as well. So I love that. So we'll put links to that so people can get their copy of the pack of cards as well. If you could only recommend one book to our listeners, not one of your own, because we're going to have the link to your new book, but if it was one book by another author, what book would it be and why?
Oh boy, there's so many. I feel like I got to turn around and look at my bookshelf
library
around here behind me. Oh my gosh, this is such a hard question. I feel like when I think about the books that really influenced me, if you're interested in personal creativity, I think The Artist's Way is just a great classic. And I will say it can be for some a little woo-woo, it can be, but if you can look past that there's some really good stuff in there. And it's been around for, I think, about 30 years. So it's a,
yes,
it's a classic.
early 80s. Yeah, I mean, Julia Cameron and I'm always, I think it's a particularly good book for people who are a little bit into their life, into their career, and they feel like they need a restart. They really need to reconnect with something deeper in themselves. And I think what she talks about in the book in terms of her background and challenges that she went through, I remember like the artist date, was I remember one of the ones, which I thought was really lovely. Just taking that time just to make a date for yourself, to go and do something, just to kind of feed that creativity. Wonderful book. So we'll definitely put a link to Julia Cameron's The Artist Way. And what is the best way for people to connect with you and to learn more about your book and your work?
You can find me online at, my website is climerconsulting.com, and Climer is spelled Climer. And on my webpage, you can reach out to me via email. You'll find links to the book. You'll find links to the Climer Cards that I mentioned. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can find me there, Amy Climer.
Well, Dr. Amy Climer, thank you so much for being a guest on the Super Creativity Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, James. I appreciate it.
You can subscribe to the Super Creativity Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast. While you're there, leave us a review. I would really, really appreciate it. I'm James Taylor, and you've been listening to the Super Creativity Podcast.